So today's readings have quite a strong theme amongst them. And our first sort of foray into that is from the first reading when we get a glimpse into a portion of this story between King Saul and his servant David. And we know at this point in that story, David has already come on the scene. He's no longer a shepherd. He's in the king's service. He's already told Saul that he would fight the Goliath to save Israel from the Philistines, and he's defeated Goliath. And David has become great in the eyes of Israel for saving the nation. But what happens is that King Saul, who originally loves David for what he has done, grows envious of David. And so in his envy begins to hate David and begins to let his envy and hate grow so much that he actually wants to put David's life to an end. So we get this dramatic decision where David is in hiding at this moment in the story. He's gone off into the hills, and so Saul says, I'm going to pick 3,000 of my best soldiers, and I'm coming to find you. I'm going to end your life. This is affect the aggression of King Saul towards David. And what's incredible about this story, and I would say especially because it occurs in the Old Testament, it's kind of a rare example, that David responds to Saul's aggression with mercy, which is so outside of what's expected, it almost seems like he's dumb. I mean, in his own servant, right? They sneak up upon Saul and they're like, look, you literally have this man in the palm of your hands. His own spear, you can thrust him, you can kill him right now. And you have the right because he's unjustly pursuing your life. And the law says tit for tat, eye for an eye. David, can't you just do this? And David says no. But David remains righteous in God's sight by not responding to aggression with aggression, but by responding to aggression with mercy, so that it can be seen who is truly the just one, right? And so he's making a point. He says to Saul, in effect, from the other hillside, he says, who is just between you and me? Who does God look upon with righteousness, you or me? I'll let God decide, but here's your spear. And so in the gospel, Jesus gets to much the same reality. Jesus, we know, comes to earth to do all kinds of important things. And one of the important things that Jesus attends to about us, for us, on our behalf, is he walks into the reality of the grief in our human relationships. And this is something Jesus comes to address. This is something he comes to work on. A path he opens up for us, something he wants to heal. Because grief in our human relationships is real. It's a real thing. And not all grief in human relationships are the same. We also know this. Sometimes grief happens between people. Say, for example, my friend comes up to me and says, Brian, I have to give you some bad news. I went to the doctor the other day and they found something weird in my scan. I have to go back. It might be serious. I'm not sure yet, but I'm a little bit worried. Now, that brings grief to me. And when my relationship with this person bears that kind of grief, well, that kind of grief brings us closer to each other, doesn't it? It actually draws us in. It helps me to pray for that friend and to say, God, help them, and God, have mercy on them, or God, give me strength to help them in whatever way they need. And not all grief is that way. Jesus doesn't talk about that kind of grief. There's another kind of grief in human relationships that doesn't unite us, but it divides us. That's the kind of grief that Jesus speaks about. That kind of grief, as with all grief, is sort of like a heavy laden burden, and it can be caused by anything, really. Fear, frustration, anger, annoyance, injustice, this, that, the other. All kinds of stuff can happen between us and other people that would make us feel separated from them, divided from them, isolated from them. The Lord knows that this is an issue because for the most part in human experience, when that kind of grief comes to pass, the only thing that it bears is more of the same. And so Jesus wants to look at that, and he says, if you're listening to my voice, let's consider these things. Jesus says, We all know that grief happens. We all know that burdens happen. And Jesus says, when that burden happens because an enemy hates you, what about then? What do you do with that kind of grief? What about people who curse you or mistreat you? What do you do with that kind of suffering? Does someone strike you on the cheek or take your cloak? That, of course, could be literal, but for the most part, it's probably usually figurative to us. Like if someone insults you, if someone detracts against you, if someone gossips about you, if someone takes from your good reputation, what about then? The Lord asks. And if someone takes something from you and does not intend to give it back, what about that grief, Jesus says? What about those that you lend something to them of your own accord, but you don't think they're going to repay you? When you feel that way, what do you do with that? Jesus says, do we just do good to those who are good to us? Do we just love those who love us? For that I say, even the sinners do. But what about those who are ungrateful to you? What about those who are wicked? What about that grief? What kind of response does that grief bear? What's the fruit of that grief in your life? Right? It's a challenging thing. I was really praying about that this week and just asking God to open that up and saying, God, why do we do that? Why is it that way? Why is it that grief happens in this way that makes us feel like it's us versus them, or me versus you, or my view versus your view, or my people versus your people? What's underneath that? And in prayer, I just kind of saw in my imagination, God set my feet down on the sand of a shore, and he just invited me, and he said, look out. And so in my imagination, I just kind of looked out, and of course, as you can imagine, you see the shoreline and the water and the waves coming up and the sort of the immensity of the water, and you keep looking up, and then eventually, if we look far enough, we get to that place where the water meets the sky. And as I looked out to that place where the water meets the sky, God said, all human understanding has a horizon. All human understanding has a horizon. It has a limit. And based upon the measurements of that limit will typically depend the measurements of our thinking in those places of grief that divide us. He said most of the time it's instinct for us to just live from inside of our horizons, from within the places of the things that we can see and understand and know. And it is the scribe of that horizon which will influence what we actually see when we see something. And depending on what we see, that will influence what we think about what we see, and then what we judge based upon what we've thought, and then, of course, how we respond based upon what we've judged. And that it's not meant to sound really convoluted. It's actually something that's so quick, so automatic, so like instinct. It happens in us before we even think about it, before we even know it's happening. I'll give you an example. Let's just do a hypothetical. If I brought before us, say, a man who was a complete stranger to me, he was an older gentleman, just kind of imagine this with me, and his hair is really long and unkempt and off to the side, and half of his teeth have fallen out. He's got bad breath, and in fact, he just smells bad in general. And he has clothes that are ripped and torn and raggedy, and he kind of slumps to one side with one eye cocked. Now, I wouldn't know that man from Adam, but if he was standing here and I was standing there and I were to look at him, what would I see? What would I see? And here's the thing. We all have a kind of instinct that begins to happen before we even know it's happening, because all of us have a horizon of our human understanding. And the instinct of our human understanding would probably go something like this. I would stand across from that man, perfect stranger, look at him, see him, and I would say to myself, this man's probably homeless. I don't know the last time he slept in his own bed. Evidently, he's not showered for a while. He's probably an alcoholic. He may be a drug addict. I don't think he has a bank account. His family's probably abandoned him or failed him in some major way in life. I'll bet he's made a lot of decisions that he's ashamed of. And I don't know the last time he has had even a warm shower or a bite of food. That would happen in about a half a second in my mind if all I had was the limits of my human understanding. But now consider this. If I was standing there and he was standing here, but there was a second person standing next to me, and that second person was that man's brother, and if that brother was looking at him, who would he see? But if the two of us happened to be standing next to that man's mother, and that mother was looking at the same person, who would she see? And if the three of us were standing next to that man's abandoned child, who would that abandoned child see? But if the four of us were standing next to that man's best friend, who would that best friend see? And if the five of us were standing next to that man's social worker, who would that social worker see? But if the six of us were standing next to the store owner underneath whose door that man slept every night, and that store owner looked at that man, who would he see? But what if the seven of us were standing next to the store clerk who sold him alcohol every Tuesday, and that store clerk looked at that man, who would that store clerk see? And if the eight of us were standing next to that man's childhood enemy or high school coach, and those two looked at that man, who would they see? And here's what's so obvious to all of us, that you could line up 10 people looking at the same person, and none of them would see the same thing. Nobody. Everybody would see something different, because by instinct, we depend upon the horizons of our own understanding, of our own experience, and it happens without us even knowing it's happening. And God just really convicted me. He said, and this is the way the world is, isn't it? That grief happens, brokenness happens, suffering happens, and we look at that and we say, I've seen that before. I know what that's all about. And what it tends to do is it tends to make us look like me and not me. My view and not my view. Us, them. My people, their people. It's a dividing thing. And then God said, but I don't have horizons. And when I see according to the fullness. Because if the 10 of us were there, and on the end of that line, God stood as the 11th person, and God looked at this man, who would God see? And this is just how realistic life is, and how realistic and personal the gospel is, because the gospel says all kinds of the same stuff. The gospel says bad things happen. Interpersonal relationships don't always look great. Sometimes people are ungrateful or wicked. Sometimes people curse and mistreat and strike and steal. And what's the solution, Jesus asks? Where's the end game? You know? Because for the most part, it just looks like more of the same. And God says, I haven't created anybody to live that way. We got to be able to do something different. And so he's so provocative. He says, how about this? Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Don't judge, and you'll not be judged. Don't condemn, and you'll not be condemned. Forgive, and you also will be forgiven. Give, and gifts will be given to you. And just the zinger at the end, for I say to you truly, whatever it is that you measure with, that will in turn be measured out to you. So in life, if all we have to go by is our natural knowledge or our instincts, and we are committed to the limits of our own horizons, we probably wouldn't like the same in opposite fashion, like towards ourselves. But Jesus says this is how it will be if this is how we live. It can be no other way. He gives a version of that golden rule, right? He says, instead, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And perhaps maybe a more direct way of saying it is this: do unto others as God has done unto you. Do unto others as God has done unto you. This was really transformative in my own life of faith in my early 20s. I was never really aware growing up that I wasn't circumspect. I wasn't self-reflective on my own thought patterns. You know, we just make those snap judgments. We try to figure the world out, but we only know based upon what we've experienced so far, and so it's so simple and automatic for us to put people in places, especially when people are frustrating. And when people are frustrating, we're always just like, well, why aren't they more like me? Or why don't they just stop doing what they're doing? And sometimes we might even and I would usually sometimes even get kind of self-righteous about it. I'd get really holy about it. I'd pray for that person. We all know how that goes, don't we? We say, God, would you just help that person repent? God, would you just change that person? Or if we're feeling really spicy, we're like, God, if you just smite that person, I'd be okay with it. Sometimes we just pray, we're like, God, just bring your justice down. Sometimes people just need a whooping, Lord. You know what I mean? We've all prayed that way, and if you deny it, you're lying. And at a certain point, God just redirected me, and he said, Brian, when that happens, when your heart feels the grief that divides you, start with this: Lord, have mercy on me. Lord, have mercy on me. It's a strange thing to see someone else's brokenness and then immediately ask that God would have mercy on you instead of them. But why is that crucial? Why is that important? Well, because otherwise we tend to get stuck in our own horizons, and we don't have an ability to trust. You know, God says, but I would do this differently. And we say, but that's beyond the horizon. I can't see what's out there. And God says, but I can see it. I know what's beyond the horizon, and I would do it this different way. Would you trust me to do it this different way? And the beauty of it is this: when we look upon the world and we say, God, that person is broken, which he already knows. And instead we say, God, I'm broken, which we don't know most of the time. But if instead we say, God, I'm broken, God, have mercy on me. Or Augustine, if I remember rightly, he said, but by the grace of God, there go I. Except for the grace of God, I'm just not far removed from all of the bad stuff. If we begin to look at our own lives and how God has had mercy upon us, we are now empowered to go back into the world that is divided and give mercy to the world, because the mercy of God is the only thing that heals the division of the world. And it's something that we live with every day, and you're going to live with it for the rest of your life, because division is on every screen that you're ever going to look at ever again from here on out. Think about your cell phone. Think about your computer. Think about your TV. Think about everything that you take in from the outside world, and what language is used. Always, 99% of the time, except for us and not us, we and they, me versus not me, my view versus their view. 6th chapter of Luke, 2022. So it is in our midst. And instead of more of the same, instead of just continuing to bear along these heavy laden burdens in our lives, we have to ask God, beg God, that we would see not with our own vision, but that we would see with God's vision. Because when we see with God's vision, mercy comes into the world. If we see what God sees, we begin to think what God thinks. And when we begin to think what God thinks, we begin to judge as God judges, who, by the way, judges with mercy. And when we judge as God judges, we begin to respond and to act as God would act. And the world becomes whole again. But it all comes down to the freedom of your choice and my choice. And nobody can choose it for us. We have to decide it. We have to ask for it. We have to begin by saying, God, have mercy on me. And if we need any help with that, God, how do I no longer measure with man's measurements? How do I measure with God's measurements? God, when you look at me, how do you measure me? How do I stack up on the divine scale? How much do I weigh? Where do I land? And God says, I'd say